back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. So we're here today talking to Kevin Randle about his book, Crash, When UFOs Fall from the Sky. His website is kevinrandle.blogspot.com. But there's the music. Do-do-do. And here's this week's Mind Yoga question. In this Kabbalistic system of assigning numerical values to a word or phrase, or this Kabbalistic system is created by assigning numerical values to a word or a phrase in the belief that mystical insights can be derived or a new interpretation of the text can be discovered from words or phrases with identical numerical values. What is the name of this Kabbalistic system? If you know the answer to the question, if you think you know the answer to the question, if you maybe think you know the answer to the question, stretch your mind and send an email to justenergyradio@yahoo.com. The person who answers the question correctly, the first person to answer the question correctly, will win a copy of William Baldwin's CE6, Close Encounters of the Possession Kind. So don't forget. And if you're listening to the show in the archive, we have had people enter into the Mind Yoga question after the show has aired. So just because you're not listening to it live doesn't mean you can't win. So let me get Kevin back on the air so that we can continue on in our conversation. Hey, Kevin, we're back.
I'm here. I'm back.
Before the break, you were talking about Roswell and the testimony and testimony being changed and shifted, et cetera, et cetera. And with Roswell, I can understand where there might be some differences because of the whole concept of the witnesses being threatened by the government, that if you talk, we'll kill you, and nothing was said, nothing was spoken out in public, and their short stories weren't shared for, 40 years, 30-plus years. But when you're talking about incidents like Sag Harbor or Kecksburg, we're not talking all that long. Did those people get the same kind of warnings from the government, or were they out there and available to be interviewed at the point or, just after the incidents happened?
Well, that's an interesting point. In Roswell, most of the witnesses were military. And so the government could come in and say, this is classified top secret, you cannot talk about it under penalty of law. And it makes perfect sense. And, of course, they're not going to talk about it. Some of the civilian witnesses, Mac Brazel, the rancher who found it, told his son Bill, who told us, that they had asked him not to talk about it, that it was a classified project. And Bill Brazel said, my dad was such a fellow that if somebody asked him not to talk about it, well, he just wouldn't. And he wouldn't tell Bill much about it either, but told Bill a little bit about it. Some of the witnesses say that they were threatened with jail. Some of them actually say they were told if they talked about it, they would be taken out into the desert and they wouldn't be coming back, which is not a very veiled threat. But there were hints of Roswell from that point on, but the government did such a great job of convincing everybody that what fell at Roswell was a balloon that nobody really talked about it. When we get to Kecksburg, you got people like Stan Gordon, who was there almost immediately, even though he was a teenager at the time, but Stan was there investigating right away and talking to witnesses, and so there wasn't the same kind of pressure not to talk about it that there was with Roswell. And the government had kind of picked up a lot of the stuff and taken it away before anybody had a chance to look at it. And the state police were involved, and they talked about it a little bit. But interesting enough, there was a radio show done called Object in the Woods by a reporter for a local station. And according to him, he had interviews with the people right after the events happened, and he was cutting together his hour-long program. And just prior to it being aired, a number of people called and said, well, we really wished you wouldn't use our names in the program, which kind of cut the vitality out of the program. But I'm not sure that the pressure was threats in the same vein that we got in Roswell, but there was some of that. Shag Harbor was Canadian, and again, most of the witnesses were police officers or military. Sure, there were some civilian witnesses, but most of them were military or government employees in some fashion, and so the appeal was that you can't talk about this. If you do, you're going to jail for 20 years, and it's going to be a $10,000 fine or something like that, which pretty much kept people from talking. And I know Chris Stiles, talking about in his research of Shag Harbor, ran into some roadblocks for documentation he wanted. The documents, well, these documents don't exist, or they weren't filed where they were supposed to be. And he did eventually find some of them. So there's some of that hanky-panky going on. But once we move out of Roswell, and I think the difference here is, in Roswell, they didn't really know what was going on. They're suddenly presented with the evidence that we're being visited by alien creatures, and they don't know what the alien creatures are after. They don't know whether it's the precursor to an invasion. They just don't know what's going on. The longer the time passes between the event and any kind of invasion, the safer they began to feel. So when we get into 1967 with Shag Harbor, 1965 with Kecksburg, their attitudes are a little bit different, and they've realized that this program that they instituted in the early 1940s, or the mid-1940s, of ridicule is the way to go. People aren't going to believe there's flying saucers with little green men. In fact, we've got news headlines, for example, that say flying saucers seen in 23 states except Kansas. Kansas is a dry state at the time. You couldn't buy alcohol there, implying everybody's a drunk, of course. Or the idea, and you still see it prevalent today, that the only people who see flying saucers are the guys in bib overalls with 3 teeth and a broken-down pickup truck living in the backwoods, which is not true. What we find is that the better cases come from higher-educated people who get a good look at the object, as opposed to somebody who might not be as well-educated who doesn't get a good look at the object. So that all comes into play. So by the time we get to the mid-1960s, it's kind of you don't want to be one of those people that see flying saucers, do you? Implying that you're crazy or you're drunk, something like that. So we don't have the same kind of pressures, but we do see some of that applied to people. And Ed Ruppelt, who was one time the chief of Project Blue Book, said the only time they used the term flying saucer was in a derogatory sense. Oh, you're one of those that see flying saucers, as opposed to UFOs or something mysterious in the sky.
It's like I'm looking at the clock going, not enough time. And this is one question that I have been dying to ask you, so I want to get it in, even though we're really kind of changing topics here. In your book, you talk about, and this isn't really the question, this is kind of leading, you talk about a lot of UFO crashes or reported crashes prior to Roswell, which is, what I think in a lot of people's mind was the first crash to happen. And so my question is, has anybody gone back to where some of these reported crash sites were and looked for physical evidence?
Yes, I can answer that. Yes.
I knew you would know.
1897, there was what was called the Great Airship. A lot of the reports clearly are faked. I mean, you read the reports and the guy saying, well, the ship landed out here. I went and talked to the crew. And they were on their way to bomb the Spanish in Cuba. And what you have to remember, this is just prior to the Spanish-American War, which took place in Cuba. So there's an awful lot of that sort of thing going on there. They're practicing for their bombing attacks on Cuba, which is kind of interesting. But there was a case in Aurora, Texas from mid-April, April 14th, I think it was, 1897, where a UFO, an object supposedly came in low over the town, hit a windmill, exploded. They picked up the body of the alien creature, a fellow named T.J. Weems, who was supposedly a Signal Corps officer, and in 1897, Signal Corps met intelligence, who said that he was probably a fellow from Mars. They buried him in the local cemetery and picked up a lot of the debris, and the next day, there was, all the debris was picked up. There's never any follow-up in the newspaper about the